If you are quiet, you have probably heard this line 1,000 times. Why are you so quiet? As if silence is a crime scene and you are the prime suspect. Let me say this clearly, being quiet is not a weakness, it is a filter. Because loud does not mean confident. Loud often means I cannot sit with my own thoughts for 5 seconds, so everyone else has to hear them. And yes, society loves noise. Noise looks like personality. Noise looks like leadership. Noise looks like certainty, even when it is just anxiety wearing a microphone. Here is the shocking trait quiet people tend to have. They do not react at the same speed as everyone else, not because they are slow, but because they are processing more. They pause, they observe, they measure the room, and then, if it is worth it, they speak. That pause scares people. Because it forces them to face something terrifying, their own words, their own energy, their own intentions. Quiet people do not fill space just to prove they exist. They do not talk to calm the room. They do not talk to calm themselves. They do not narrate every thought like it is a live podcast. They are not passive. They are selective. And that is why some people misunderstand you. They think you are shy when you are simply focused. They think you are insecure when you are simply careful. They think you are judging them, when you are really just watching the situation unfold like a free documentary. So in this video, I am going to break down what is really happening in the mind of quiet people, the trait most people never notice. The reason silence feels powerful, and the 4 types of quiet people you will instantly recognize. One of those types is going to hit uncomfortably close. And when it does, you will know exactly why you have always felt different. Here is the trait, explained without drama, without fluff, and without pretending it is mystical. Quiet people have a higher internal processing threshold. That means they do not respond to every stimulus immediately. Not every comment. Not every opinion. Not every emotional spike in the room. While most people react outwardly first and think later, quiet people think first, then decide if a reaction is even necessary. This is why silence makes others uncomfortable. Because silence removes the feedback loop they rely on. When someone talks nonstop, they are often regulating themselves externally. They speak to feel grounded. They speak to feel validated. They speak to reassure themselves that they are being seen. Quiet people do the opposite. They regulate internally. They let thoughts complete themselves before releasing them. They let emotions settle before expressing them. They let situations reveal their shape before stepping in. And this is where the misunderstanding begins. To a reactive person, this looks like hesitation. To an insecure person, this looks like judgment. To a loud culture, this looks like weakness. But psychologically, it is the opposite. A higher processing threshold means you can tolerate uncertainty longer. You can sit in ambiguity without panicking. You can listen without needing to interrupt the moment with your identity. That is not passivity. That is emotional strength. Here is a line that might feel uncomfortably accurate. Quiet people are not waiting to speak. They are deciding if the situation deserves their energy at all. Most conversations do not. Most opinions do not. Most social performances are just noise disguised as urgency. And this is why quiet people often feel drained by environments where everyone is talking, but nothing meaningful is actually being said. If this part already feels personal, good. That means you are recognizing a pattern you have lived with for years, without ever having language for it. And now that we have named the trait clearly, we need to talk about how it shows up differently depending on the person. Because not all quiet people are quiet for the same reason. In the next part, I am going to break down the 4 types of quiet people, and one of them is going to explain your entire social experience with uncomfortable accuracy. The 4 types of quiet people, not all quiet people are quiet for the same reason. That is the mistake everyone makes. Silence looks the same from the outside, but internally it comes from very different mechanisms. Here are the 4 most common types. As you listen, notice which one feels less like a description and more like someone quietly reading your diary. Type 1. The observer. This type is quiet because they are always scanning the room. They notice tone shifts. They notice who changes energy when someone walks in. They notice what is said, and more importantly, what is avoided. While others are talking, the observer is building a mental map. Who is insecure? Who is performing? Who is leading? Who is lying? By the time the conversation ends, they already understand the dynamics better than anyone who spoke. Here's the sarcastic part. People assume the observer is not participating, when in reality, they already finished the analysis while everyone else was still warming up their opinions. Many observers learned early that listening gives them leverage, so they stayed quiet and the room revealed itself. If you have ever felt like you walk away from conversations knowing more than you said, you might be this type. Type 2. The selective speaker. This type is quiet because they hate wasting words. They speak when there is substance. They stay silent when there is not. They do not jump into conversations to mark territory. They do not talk just to stay visible. They do not comment on everything to prove intelligence. And when they finally speak, the room often goes quiet. Not because they are intimidating, but because their words tend to land. Here is the irony. The selective speaker is often told to talk more by people who talk constantly and say very little. They learn that restraint creates weight. That silence sharpens impact. That fewer words used well travel further. If people often say, you do not talk much, but when you do, it matters, this is probably you. Type 3. The emotionally self-controlled. This type is quiet because they process emotions internally. They do not narrate every feeling. They do not outsource regulation to the room. They do not treat every emotional spike like a public announcement. They feel deeply, they just do not leak it everywhere. And in a culture that confuses oversharing with authenticity, this gets misunderstood fast. They are told they are closed off. They are told they are distant. They are told they are hard to read. In reality, they are simply private with their inner world. Here is a quiet truth. Emotional control looks suspicious to people who rely on emotional display to feel real. If you have ever been accused of being cold when you were simply calm, this type will hit close. By the way, because a lot of people ask what to do next when they realize this about themselves, I left something pinned in the comments. If it is useful to you, it is there. Now let me finish this. Type 4, the strategic silent. This type is quiet on purpose. They understand something most people ignore. Silence makes others talk. And when people talk, they reveal priorities, insecurities, motivations, and intentions. The strategic silent does not interrupt momentum. They let it run. They do not correct people immediately. They let them explain themselves. They are not passive. They are patient. This is why some people feel strangely exposed around them without knowing why. Silence creates space. And space invites projection. If you have ever noticed that people tell you more than they plan to, just because you stayed quiet, this type might explain a lot. If one of these types stood out instantly, you already know which one it was. And in the next part, we need to talk about why loud environments feel exhausting for people like you, and why it has nothing to do with social anxiety and everything to do with how your mind processes stimulation. If you are quiet, you probably do not dislike people. You dislike unfiltered stimulation. That is an important difference most people miss. Loud environments are not just noisy. They are cognitively expensive. Multiple conversations overlap. Opinions compete for attention. Emotions leak everywhere. Everyone is reacting in real time, out loud, all at once. For a mind with a high internal processing threshold, this is not energizing. It is overload. While others are bouncing from stimulus to stimulus, your brain is trying to process everything fully. Tone, context, intent, contradiction, subtext. It is like being forced to read 4 books at the same time, while someone keeps tapping you on the shoulder asking, "So what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?" Here is the sarcastic truth. Many social settings are not conversations, they are performances. People talk to stay visible. They talk to hold the floor. They talk because silence makes them uncomfortable. Quiet people feel drained not because they lack social skills, but because they are absorbing far more information than they are expressing. This is why small talk feels exhausting. Not because it is meaningless, but because it demands output without substance. It asks you to speak without purpose, to react without reflection, to trade depth for noise, and your nervous system notices. This is also why quiet people often come alive in the right environment. One-on-one conversations, calm spaces, discussions with substance. Suddenly, the energy is there. The clarity is there. The words show up naturally. That is not a contradiction. That is alignment. If you have ever felt like 2 different people, depending on the environment, silent and drained in loud spaces, focused and articulate in calm ones, there is nothing wrong with you. Your mind is simply not designed for chaos as entertainment. And once you understand this, something important shifts. Because the problem was never that you were too quiet. The problem was that the environment demanded noise instead of meaning. In the next part, we need to talk about the biggest mistake people make when they interpret quiet behavior, and why this misunderstanding creates unnecessary friction in relationships, work, and social life. This is where things start going wrong socially. Quiet behavior gets misread constantly, not because it is unclear, but because most people interpret silence through their own habits. They assume everyone functions like they do. So when a quiet person does not speak, others fill in the blanks. They assume disinterest. They assume arrogance. They assume insecurity. They assume judgment. Rarely do they assume control. Here is the uncomfortable truth. People who talk a lot often believe silence means something is missing, because for them, silence usually does. If they are quiet, it is because they are confused. If they are quiet, it is because they are unsure. If they are quiet, it is because they have nothing to add. So when they meet someone who is quiet by choice, it breaks their internal model. And when people do not understand something, they project onto it. This is why quiet people are often described with contradictions. Very calm but intimidating. Nice but hard to read. Smart but distant. None of those are flaws. They are side effects of restraint in a culture that rewards exposure. Here's a line that tends to hit people hard. Quiet people are not withholding themselves. They are protecting their energy from environments that do not deserve full access. Silence is not rejection. It is boundary. And boundaries confuse people who rely on constant external feedback to feel secure. This is also why quiet people often feel misunderstood at work. The loudest voice gets credited as leadership. The fastest response gets mistaken for confidence. The person who speaks last or not at all gets overlooked, until something goes wrong. Then suddenly the quiet person is asked, "What do you think?" And when they speak, the room realizes something too late. This person has been paying attention the entire time. If you have ever felt underestimated, only to be taken seriously once you finally spoke, you are not imagining it. That pattern is real. And it leads to an important question. What do you actually do with quiet power once you recognize it? That is what we need to talk about next. How to stop treating quietness like something to fix, and start using it as an advantage without becoming louder or pretending to be someone else. Once you understand this, something shifts. You stop trying to correct yourself. You stop forcing energy that is not natural to you. You stop treating silence like a flaw that needs an apology. Quiet power is not about becoming louder. It is about becoming intentional. You do not need to speak faster. You do not need to speak more. You do not need to compete for attention in rooms that reward noise over meaning. You choose where your voice belongs. Silence becomes a tool, not a gap. A pause becomes a signal, not a weakness. Presence becomes more important than performance. Here's the part most people miss. Quiet people are often the most stable people in the room because they are not being pulled in every emotional direction. They respond, they do not react. And that distinction matters more than confidence, charisma, or volume ever will. If you recognize yourself in any of the types we talked about, observer, selective speaker, emotionally self-controlled, strategic silent, there is nothing to fix. There is only something to understand. Not every room deserves your energy. Not every conversation deserves your thoughts. Not every moment deserves your voice. And the people who understand this tend to move through life with less noise, fewer regrets, and far more clarity. If this described you a little too accurately, you already know why silence has always felt natural to you. You were not missing something. You were filtering. And once you stop apologizing for that, quiet stops being invisible. It becomes powerful. If you want to keep exploring the psychology behind things most people never explain, you know where to find the rest. Now sit with that for a moment.